I'm Marilyn Laszlo. I'm a Hoosier farm girl. My grandparents, they came from Hungary and settled in northern Indiana and gave us the land that we're still on today. And in fact, living in the house that my dad built when I was just a little girl. And my grandparents never did learn any English, and so we all had to learn a little bit Hungarian. Actually, my father, he didn't know any English until he went to first grade, just a little school about 3 miles from here. And actually it's where all 4 of us girls went to elementary school, the same school that my dad went to when he was just a little boy. And here we are 56 years later on this same farm. Of course, it looks a little bit differently than it did back in the early days when there was just nothing on this property, not even one tree or one bush. But I'd like to just take you a little tour around the farm, since this is where it all started, right here, and just visit and explain some of the buildings and where I grew up. I love coming across the road to my grandparents' place. You know, like I said, they never did learn any English. And my grandfather had this big, thick mustache, and he was just a very colorful man. Anyway, I remember as a little girl holding my grandfather's hand and just walking behind a single-bottom plow behind a horse. They never farmed with any equipment. And you know, this is it. This is the barn, and this is the house. Of course, it's owned by other people. But this is where, you know, I grew up learning how to make hay, learning how to milk cows like this. And this is the house. Of course, it wasn't quite this big. This whole section here was not there, and the section from the fireplace on this way. So it was just the middle section that was built. And we didn't have any windows, so we had tar paper on the windows. I mean, I can't believe how we lived. But you know, we were a happy family, and that's what counts. And that's how it started. And we added on to the house, and now it's you know, it's a delightful little house. But this is the same house back in the 30s, 60-some years ago. We didn't have indoor plumbing, so we had an outhouse, and I'd like to show you that. It's still here, except we kind of added on to it. Now it's, from the outhouse it became a playhouse, and now it's a storage house. But this is the spot, right up here. This is where we had an outhouse. Of course, it was just you know, half that size. Now it's a storage house. And then we had a pump that was in the backyard, and it looked something like this one. Let me show you the pump. Oh my gosh. We have a lot of stuff that flies over, directly over this. What do you call it, a blimp? I'll tell Patsy to come and look out the blimp. We had a pump just like this. It actually was in the backyard. And I remember going out and just pumping buckets of water, bringing it in to take a bath in a big round tub. But that's what it was like when I was all the way into high school. We didn't have a telephone, certainly didn't have TV. We watched, listened to radio programs. But what a rich background. You know, I think about my background and how God uses every part of our life. You know, even before we're born, He's got it all planned out for us. But I think about my background. I was born during the Deep Depression, and so, you know, everybody was poor. We didn't know we were poor. We were in this small Hungarian, Polish farming community. And but you know, we lived off the land. We made everything on the farm. We butchered every month. I remember right. I can almost tell you the spot that we would butcher a pig or a cow, and learning how to do that. And we had our own sausage. We had our own smokehouse. Had our own ham. We made our own butter. We made our own cottage cheese. We made our own soap. Everything. We hardly ever had to go to the store for anything, maybe like coffee or sugar or salt. And I think about that. What an incredible preparation for what God was really calling me to do later on in life. Okay, we're just going to walk over here. I just want to show you that many years ago, I can't remember how long, maybe 30 years ago, I don't know, that a toll road went through 10 acres of our land. And now we have this noise and all this traffic. It used to be so quiet. You could hear the birds and the crickets and the frogs. And well, in the morning I could still hear the birds, but it's just a constant sound that just never goes away 24 hours a day. And we lost 10 acres, which was kind of sad. You can't fight City Hall. It's just the way it goes. Over here, where you see all this cement, where we got the cars parked, that was the barn. And in I think it was 1997, there was a fire. I was actually mowing the lawn, and I had some straw stacked up pretty high outside of the one corner of the barn. And I was coming around the corner there, and I saw the straw. Straw was burning, and by the time the fire department got here, the whole barn had burned down. It had a loft up in the top, and where I kept the tractor, and very, very sad. But so we lost a lot of things, but life goes on. I don't think we really need to lock it. Okay, we're going to do it. Oh, you already got it? Mm-hmm. Let's turn on some lights here. Anyway, when I cleaned it all out, shoveled out all the manure, and got a carpenter from the church, and we kind of designed it. And then it became like a museum after I got back from New Guinea. I kept bringing back so many artifacts, and this whole thing was just filled with artifacts. You can see that we still have a few up. But it was kind of like a wasted space, and we really needed an office. So then it became an office, and this is this is really neat. What? Yeah, I still have a few artifacts around. Actually, we're going to go see where the barn used to be. We had a fire, and when I took all the artifacts out of here, I put it in the barn. And I imagine I lost about $500,000 worth of artifacts. But I have a few that are still hanging around here that I have up. But anyway, this is just a beautiful place to come out and be quiet and do your office work. I have my mom's phone is here, and my phone is here, and just a neat little office. Okay. The whole thing again? Yeah. This is quite a landmark. This is the corn crib. I remember shoveling corn into here, and now I'm just letting the grapevines grow over it. I planted some flowers, and it's kind of fun to when spring comes around to plant new flowers, and I think it's beautiful with all the grapevines. Well, here's all my dad's tools, and I have a hard time even thinking about giving them away, but I remember my dad spent so much time keeping all the equipment going. And I used to ride on the back of the tractor before I was big enough to actually drive the tractor, and watched him use all these tools, and there's so many memories here. And he's always forever repairing something. So this is it. I mean, we have every kind of tool you can think of. In fact, some of them I have in toolboxes. I don't even have them all out. But I've used all this stuff. You know, I've had to jump start even the lawnmowers and the cars. So I have the jump starts. I had to pull stuff out of the mud. I used the chains. These are carpenter tools. I've used the levels. I've used the saws. And over here's all the grease and the oil and all these gas cans, and this is a grease gun. Most important. My dad told me this is crucial that you grease every part of the machinery, the tractor, the disc, the drag, and so that's, you know, learning how to use the grease gun again after all these years. Fun. I love it. Back on the farm. My mom and dad sent all 4 of us girls to church, and this is the little country church. It was a one-room schoolroom building. when I was growing up, and we converted into a little church of about 35 members. And you know, it's only about a mile and a half from the house, and we actually could walk to church. But this is where, you know, I accepted the Lord, and we're going to go inside and just give you a little bit more of my testimony. If you see here where there's a little potbelly stove, you see the part where there was a little potbelly stove here, and you can see some of the marks. Well, this is where it all started, in this little country church that was this one-room schoolroom building. And we were all in elementary, and I'm the oldest of the 4 girls, and I remember sitting right here in the corner on the front pew, because I was so excited about these stories. But you know, I was kind of like a little rascal. And I was always wiggling around and talking, and always had to be disciplined. But you know, I say to parents and grandparents, listen, never underestimate the power of the Word of God on a little child's heart, because that's where it begins. And people need to understand it. It really begins in elementary. Well, anyway, I remember hearing these stories, and it was such a Bible-preaching church. I'm telling you, we went from Genesis to Revelation. I don't know how many times we went through the Bible, verse by verse. It was so wonderful, and I loved it. You know, all the creation story. I remember the creation story. I was so excited about this creation story. You know how God created everything in the world, and then those stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and then the New Testament. You know, Jesus and the disciples. I was just so fascinated how the disciples followed Jesus around, and I remember very young deciding that, you know, I want to work for God. I just want to work for God. You know, like Abraham worked for God, and Isaac and Jacob and all those disciples. And then I remember when I was in junior high, and we had a missionary come to this church. Now, we hardly ever had visitors because we were so small. But anyway, he was a Moody Bible graduate, and of course we're not very far from Chicago, and he was a missionary to Russia. And he started to talk about the fact that, you know, that there are people in the world that don't know anything about Jesus. I said, wow, that just kind of just hit me. And then he said, you know, there are people in the world that don't even have the opportunity to hear anything about Jesus. And I'm telling you, that just hit me so hard. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about it, and the next day was Monday. And I knew I had to get a field ready for my dad. After high school, my pastor encouraged me to go on to college. And I went to Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee, and majored in history. It was some of the greatest years of my life. And after finishing college, then I started to teach school right here at River Forest High School. And I taught history and physical education. I was also a guidance counselor, and for 6 years. And what a mission field. I think, you know, wherever God plants us, that's a mission field. And I truly did use it as a mission field. I love teaching. I mean, it was just a wonderful experience, good preparation for what God was calling me to do. And, you know, I wasn't ashamed of the gospel. I remember reading Bible verses before my phys ed classes, and Bible verses before my history classes. And as a guidance counselor, I always kept my door open, and students would come in, and I would sit and talk with them and pray with them and encourage them to go to church. And I know that I had a real impact on my students. And it was very interesting. It was not too long ago. I was going to O'Hare Airport to go off to a meeting somewhere, and I stopped in Chesterton at the pharmacy to pick up some things, and I remember I was using my credit card, and so I was standing in line and gave the woman my card, and then I was signing the receipt, and Marilyn Laszlo, and she looked at it, just glanced at it, and then she saw my name, Marilyn Laszlo, and she said, "Marilyn Laszlo," and she said, "Well, you are my teacher. You are my teacher." And so we had a little conversation, even though there were people behind us waiting to check out. And she said, "You know, I remember you read Bible verses before your classes, and I remember one time I was crying and I came into your office and you put your arm around me and you started to pray with me and encouraged me and reminded me of the special gifts that I had, and I'll just never forget that time. And you encouraged me to go to church, and here we are, many, many years later." That was in 1962, something like that. And she said, "What you don't know is that I did accept the Lord." And so you just never know. You just never know. Wherever God puts us, that's the mission field, and that was a wonderful, wonderful blessing right there in my hometown. Well, this was the high school right here where I taught phys ed, taught volleyball, taught basketball and gymnastics, and I loved it. But you know, it was in 1965 that I finally resigned from my teaching position after 6 years of teaching, and decided to follow my dreams and become a missionary and go to an area where people just didn't have the opportunity like we have here to hear about Jesus, and that's what I did. And that started another whole area of my life in 1965. In 1965, I remember going to my pastor and saying, "You know, I think this is my last year of teaching. I just want to follow my passion, my dreams of being a missionary. And I just needed some advice." I said, "You know, I don't really know, where I'm going." And so he suggested that I write to some mission boards. So I wrote 5 letters, and here they are. And I remember it was on a Wednesday night, March 1965. Came into Valparaiso, came up to the post office. It's this building right here, the same building. And had these 5 letters and walked up to the mailbox right here by the post office, and just kind of stood there. And I was almost frozen because I thought, golly, what am I doing? I mean, I'm going to resign from my teaching position. Where am I going? You know, we want to know where we're going. And you know, the Christian life is really walking by faith. We'll never have a visual picture of tomorrow. And I was thinking, well, what do I have to lose by dropping these 5 letters in? But what do I have to lose if I don't drop them in? I mean, God can't open a door if I don't move. And so I opened it up, and I knew once I dropped these letters in, I was never going to be able to get them out again. Dropped them in and said, "Oh my goodness, I did it." And then I remember, going back to my car and went off to prayer meeting, and my heart was just beating like 60. And you know what? Within 1 week, Wycliffe Bible Translators answered my letter. They were the first one to answer, and they got my attention, and they were very interested in me. And since I was a school teacher, they knew that I would probably have the summer off, June, July, and August, and so they suggested that I go to the University of Oklahoma, where Wycliffe was teaching the linguistic course and the anthropology course, and that's exactly what I did. And I think about, God can't open a door. What a lesson. He can't open a door unless you take a step. And then every door just kept opening up one after the other until I got to New Guinea. There are nearly 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. But the number that you really need to remember, that over 3,000 do not have the Bible in their own language. That represents over 300 million people. And I think about that, over 300 million people, over 3,000 different language groups. And if any one of those people want to know anything about Jesus or anything about God, they've got to do it through the white man's language or through a national language. No man should have to learn a foreign language to find out how to spend eternity with God. Let me repeat that. No man should have to learn a foreign language to find out how to spend eternity with God. You know, if there was ever a theme that went all the way through the Bible, it's a theme of, from Genesis to Revelation, it's a theme of all the languages of the world, all the cultures of the world, and all the nations of the world. So in order to do the kind of job that we do, we have to have special training, because many of these languages that I found out are unwritten. They don't have an alphabet. They're just spoken languages, and I never realized that existed either, even when I was in college. And again, I probably heard it, but it didn't sink in, that these are only spoken languages. So we're trained as linguists. We're trained as anthropologists. First of all, we do not go to change cultures. We do not go to impose our language on these people. These are beautiful languages and cultures that God has created, and we go to preserve these languages and to preserve these cultures. And so we have special training. And I did all of my linguistic training down at the University of Oklahoma, all the anthropology training, field training, cross-cultural communications training, literacy training, how to make reading books to teach the people how to read and write their own language. And then we go through 3 months of very intensive jungle camp training. They call it field training today, but back then in 1965 it was jungle camp training. And I did my training down in the southern jungles of Mexico, and I just loved it. Learning how to, you know, build your own thatch roof house, and learning how to paddle dugout canoes, and learning how to read a compass if you get lost in the jungle, and all the things that are edible in the jungle. And we have very thorough training. We have tunnel vision. We're very goal-oriented, and we know exactly what we have to do in order to get the job done. So we go with a certain amount of confidence. You know, when I think about the languages, you know, I think it's one of the most incredible proofs of God. You know, if the universe is not enough to prove God, if creation is not enough to prove God, if life is not enough to prove God, look at the languages. I mean, nobody really touches the languages. These 7,000, there are 7,000 languages, and they're so complex that in some cases it makes English look very simple. So it's one of those incredible proofs of God, as far as I'm concerned, are the languages. That part you probably can cut out. Okay. Okay, now we're going to go to New Guinea. After my linguistic training, the focus at that time in 1965 was the South Pacific. They wanted us all to prayerfully consider the Philippines and Irian Jaya, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and so I was led to Papua New Guinea. Now, New Guinea is an island just north of Australia, and that island is kind of divided in half. The eastern half of the island is called Papua New Guinea, controlled by Australia. They're the mother country. The other side of the island is Irian Jaya, controlled by Indonesia. Well, the Papua New Guinea side has about 850 some different language families, thousands of dialects. And the interesting thing about Papua New Guinea, they did not have a national language, just all of these different languages. I remember we had been working in the Sipik-Iwam tribe for a couple of years, and there was a man from Cambridge, and he was coming into Papua New Guinea, and he was going to start at the mouth of the river, the Sepik River, which is the largest river in New Guinea. It's like the Amazon. He was going to start at the mouth of the river, and he was going to work, 2.5, 3 years, and he was going to write a PhD where all these languages came from. Well, it took him about 2.5 years to get up as far as we were, because we were 500 miles up the Sepik River. And he didn't know we were up there, but he came in and he found out that there were 2 missionaries there. And then he found out that we were linguists. We had him come into the house, and he looked like he'd been there for 2.5 years. But anyway, we gave him a cup of tea, we gave him something to drink, and we started talking about these languages. And he said, what do you think? And I've been working on this for over 2.5 years, and it's very complex. What do you think? Where do you think all these languages came from? I said, I can save you a whole lot of trouble if you just write your PhD on Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel, because I really don't think you're going to figure out where all these languages came from. But anyway, that was the beginning. That's how it started. Wycliffe sends us out 2 by 2. And out of our 6,000 members, most of our members are young married couples with little children. But about 20% are single. Out of the 20% that are single, 99.9% are women. In fact, when I got there were between 400 and 500 Wycliffe missionaries. And I remember there were about 30 to 40 single women, 3 single men. You know, those 3 single men got snatched up so fast they didn't know what hit them. But anyway, that's how we work. And back in 1967, there were a lot of restricted areas in Papua New Guinea, and Australia would only allow missionaries to go to certain areas. Of course, that has all changed now, but they had given Wycliffe a list of the areas that they had patrolled and considered safe. And so one of the areas that was on the list was a area up the Sepik River about 500 miles called the Sepik Iwam tribe. But Wycliffe didn't want 2 single women more than 1 day's canoe ride from the nearest airstrip. Well, that kind of pinpoints us a bit. That's how God guides and steers and gets you just where he wants you. And so Australia gave us this map, and on the map were all the airstrips, many from Second World War. Well, there's one airstrip on the map, and it was right there by the river. It's the closest one that we could see to the Sepik Iwam tribe. It was an airstrip called Ambunti. And we circled that on the map, Ambunti. Now, not all the villages were on the map. They were still mapping out the country. But there was one village that was on the map, and it looked like it was kind of in the center of that whole enormous Sepik Iwam tribe called Hauna, Hauna. And we circled it, and then we prayed that God would help us to find this village. Well, I remember leaving our mission station and getting in this little Cessna 206 single-engine airplane, and our pilot flew us over the jungles of Papua New Guinea for nearly 2 hours, 2.5 hours, until we got to the river and landed on this little grass airstrip. But the best that we could see from our map, we have well over 100 miles yet to go, and this is the closest that we could get. And the only way that we could get to that village was by dugout canoe. And so there was a senior translator down there, had been in New Guinea with Wycliffe for a number of years, Neil Cuyers, and he was helping us. He was giving us some training in how to handle dugout canoes and how to run an outboard motor and how to change spark plugs and clean the fuel line. And so we had a couple weeks of training right there at the river, and then we started to head upriver. I remember loading that canoe and putting in mosquito nets and mosquito repellent. It's a very heavy malaria-infested area, and medicine and canned goods and dried vegetables and a machete and an axe and a shovel and kerosene lantern, a flashlight, batteries, of course, some drinking water and our map, and we started heading upriver. Well, it took us a couple days before we actually found the village the first time we went upriver. And I remember pulling into the village. It was off a little tributary about 4 miles. It wound around like a river. Pulled in the village and we cut our motor and we're just drifting there. Houses on both sides of the river, up on stilts, thatch roof, bark floor, bark walls. Several canoes came out to meet us, and these canoes surrounded us, these men standing up in the canoes looking down at us. They were pretty afraid of our white skin. There's no white people that ever lived among these people. And so we went to shore and tried to communicate. They were monolingual people, but there are ways of communicating. And I remember the very, very first night, they gave us this old house. It was on the hill, which is a hill that was in the center of the village. And this house was up on stilts like their houses are, bark floor, bark walls, thatch roof. And I remember the orientation that Wycliffe gave to us right there in New Guinea before they sent us up. All of our training is so thorough, even after all the training here in the United States. And they told us about, the climate being very tropical rainforest, temperature 85 to 120 degrees year-round, 100% humidity, and about the different kind of disease like malaria and elephantiasis and hepatitis and yaws and leprosy and all that kind of thing. And then they told us about the common snakes in the area. And the most common snake in the area is the python, which actually is one of their creation stories that centers around the python. Now that's not a poisonous snake. It's actually a friendly snake. It just likes to give you a squeeze or a hug. Anyway, this snake can get enormous, and they can swallow whole wild boars, and they swallow whole dogs, and And but when they're young and little, they like to live up in the thatch roof of the houses. Now the other snake, I really don't know the English equivalent. I can't remember what it is, but the language word for it is mabuk, mabuk. And that's not a poisonous snake either. Actually, the people refer to this snake as the kissing snake. And all that snake wants to do is get in bed with you, like under your sleeping bag or under your mosquito net. And while you're sleeping, all that snake wants to do is just kind of crawl up and suck the saliva out of your mouth. That's why they call it the kissing snake. Well, can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine? Well, anyway, when Judy and I were putting up our mosquito nets, we put our woven mat down on the bark floor, and we have these big, huge mosquito nets, and we were tying these mosquito nets up, and I was tucking my mosquito net in real tight. Nothing's getting in, no kissing snake, nothing. And so then we blew out the lantern. This is our very first night in the village. Well, I don't know if you've ever slept overnight in really true rainforest jungle, but jungle comes alive at night. Actually, it's really like God's symphony. Every sound you can imagine, all the crickets and different birds come out, and crocodiles come out at night, and they have an unusual sound. And then you have the bats flying around, and the cicadas and the frogs, and who knows what else is out there. But the roof, the thatch roof, came alive. And we were sitting up in our mosquito nets, and we're flashing our flashlights around, and there were the little pythons up there. There were rats. There were hundreds of lizards, and there were all kinds of bugs, but there was something about the walls, something about the bark walls. It sounded like rain, and we were flashing our flashlights around, and it looked like the bark walls were covered solid with cockroaches. Well, now, what can a cockroach do to you? But there's a lot of people would say, well, weren't you afraid? Well, give me a break. Even the village people are afraid of snakes. But you know what I've learned in the 23 years that I have lived in that village, and most of those years were in a thatch roof house, that the safest place in the whole world to be is in the center of God's will. And I knew without a shadow of a doubt I was in the center of God's will. But it's interesting, you know, how Satan will kind of work on your mind in situations like that. You don't even have to be in the jungle. You don't have to be 500 miles up the Seafood River for this to happen. But what I started to worry about, I really wasn't afraid that much of the spiders and the snakes and things like that. Nobody likes those kind of things, but you learn how to live with those kind of things. I started to worry about the isolation. And I kept thinking, well, now what if I get really sick? I mean, how am I going to get out of here? I mean, you can't really get out of here very fast. It takes all day to go downriver, and then you wait the next day for your mission plane to come and get you, and then it's another day to fly you off to the hospital. Well, anyway, we're drinking the river water. We're eating their food. You know, we try to become as much of these people like we can, like the Apostle Paul said, you know, I've become all things to all people. That by all possible means, whatever it's going to take. So that's our training. And so we're eating their food, we're drinking this river water, and of course, you know, in the beginning stages, you get all kinds of stomach problems, and you get diarrhea, and all kinds of, it takes a long time to become immune to these kind of things. So every night we crawl under a mosquito net, and every night my stomach is rumbling, and I said to my partner, you know, it's my right side. It's gone to my right side. What if I have appendicitis attack? You know, I have never worried about my appendix my whole life. I've never worried about my appendix. Now here I am worrying about my appendix every night. And every night, you know, I'd crawl under the mosquito net, and my stomach is rumbling, and I say to my partner, you know, it definitely is my right side. So finally, you know, my partner said, Marilyn, why don't you just go home and get those things out and then come back and we can start our work. Well, anyway, 38 years later, right now, 2003, I still have my appendix. And that was one of the greatest lessons I think the Lord had taught me, that, you know, I'm in His hands. I'm in the safest place in the whole world to be. And so we moved on. And from that point on, and that took about a month and a half to get over that I just rested in the Lord. And then we started our work. Now, how do you begin? I mean, here's an unwritten language. You know, they had never seen paper. The word for paper is yokel, which means banana leaf, and they had never seen pencils. The word for pencil is tudian, which means thorn, and the word for writing is wuni, which means carving. Well, our first 6 months goal, and we were very goal-oriented. It's all divided into 6 months goal, and our first 6 months goal is we got to figure out the alphabet. So we learn an international phonetic system. We learn to put a symbol to every sound the vocal cords are capable of making. We don't know what we're going to hear, so we learn all the sounds. And I always like to ask people, can you do this one? Well, most everybody can do that, but I ask them how many can write it. Well, that's a very common sound in African languages, one of the letters of their alphabet. And so we start off in our field guide. We have a field guide, and the first day it says, you know, before we even have our own house built, it says, go find 10 nouns and start working on the alphabet. And I remember I started pointing to things. I remember I pointed to a stool, and he said, E-B, E-B. Well, we write it phonetically, E-E-B, E-B, chair. And then I would go through the village, and we'd practice these words that we were writing it down. Of course, some of the people had no clue what we were doing. Anyway, I remember I was trying to get the word for tree. So I'm pointing to the tree, and I kept saying, you know, tree, tree, tree. Just try to give him the idea what I wanted. Well, finally he said, Anna, Anna. So I write Anna, and I put tree. You know, then I go through the village and practice these words so that the people in the village could see that we're trying to speak their language. Well, so I got to the tree, you know, and I hung onto the tree, and I looked at my book, and I said, Anna, Anna. And they all just laughed and carried on. Well, he didn't give me the word for tree. He gave me the word for finger. You know, I'm waving my finger, and everybody's looking at my finger, and you don't point with your fingers, for one thing. You point with your chin. If I wanted the word for tree, I should have gone like this. And so you make a lot of mistakes. Well, the nouns, they're not that difficult to find. But the verbs, you got to start acting them out. So I'd sit down, get the word for sit, nadui, nadui. Write that down phonetically, nadui. And, you know, pretty soon you're getting words that don't have any new sounds or no new vowels, and it doesn't take very long to you finally exhaust it. And I remember I was talking to an old man. I wanted to get the word for jump. So I'm jumping up and down in front of this old man. He just keeps staring at me. I keep jumping up and down. And I would say, you know, in English, the word for jump, well, of course, he didn't understand English. But finally he said, Kora wa wai nanai. So I wrote Kora wa wai nanai and put jump. And then go through the village and talk to the people about these words that I'm learning. And came to the word jump, and I said, Kora wa wai nanai. Well, they all just laughed, and I mean, it was really funny. And I had no idea, but he did not give me the word for jump. What he was saying to me, why are you acting so stupid? And of course, that's fine, but I was saying that word to everybody you met in the village. Of course, that's not how you win friends and influence people. Okay, what's next there? Well, that was about 10 minutes, but that's not a very good place to end, because I think this is going to be about 30 minutes right here. I was walking through the village, you know, with my notebook and practicing the language, and people were starting to warm up to us a lot more. It's interesting, when you start speaking their language and you start eating their food, it really helps to develop a rapport. There's no question about it. But I was walking through the village, and I came to the oldest man in the village. His name is Nokian, very powerful medicine man, leader of his clan. And he calls to me, Manano, how what karilan? Marilyn, you come here. I've got something I want to ask you. He said, Oiga to om nabarari dumiyoko kora. Marilyn, every day I see you walking through the village. What is it? What is it that you're carving in that banana leaf every day with that thorn? I said, oh my goodness, you know, we've been there almost 6 months. I thought by now they knew what we were doing, and I looked at this old man, Noki, and I said, Noki, koriaiken to yokowuni kora. I'm carving your talk. My talk? You mean the words that are coming out of my mouth? You're carving on the banana leaf like the white man's talk? You know, they had the idea that only the white man's talk could be carved. That was the white man's power. I said, no, Noki, you know, God has created all the languages in the world. And God has sent me here to give you all of God's carving in your language. Well, you know, he didn't understand everything I was saying. I was using a little bit of the trade language and English. But you know what we found out very early in our language learning, and I know this is true with many of my colleagues that are working all around the world in different languages. I know it's true with other organizations that do the same thing we do, like New Tribes and Pioneer Bible and Lutheran Bible Translators and some of the Nazarene and some of the Baptists that do Bible translation. What we've all discovered, that every single language in the world has a word for Supreme Being. Isn't that interesting? And our word for Supreme Being is Adikomi Wunam, which means the Big Father Creator. And I want to tell you, my friends, when these people started to talk to God and they started to pray and they started to, just talk to, well, I got to start that part over. Okay. And I want to tell you, my friends, when these people started to pray and they started to talk to God, they would pray like this, Adi komi buenam krami siu desi mawe, oh Papa. That's how they said, oh Papa, show us the road. And this old man, and he had poor eyes. We have blindness in our village, and the life expectancy when we first got there was between 30 and 35 years of age. The infant mortality rate was about 90%. And this old man came up real close to my book, and he kept hitting it with his finger, and he kept saying, Habungi Kwara, Dima Yoko Wunan. What have you carved there? What does that say? I said, Nokin, that says Kara Omakanami. He said, that's my talk. You've carved my talk. And that old man took his wrinkled arthritic fingers, and he kept rubbing it over the banana leaf, and he kept saying, Kariyaikin, Kariyaikin, you've carved my talk. He was so excited that he decided to adopt us. He wanted to be our village father. He wanted to help us to hurry up and learn this language. He couldn't really understand why it was taking us so long. He called a whole village meeting. He got everybody gathered together, and he had to stand in front of the whole village. He says, you know what these two are doing? These two are, they're carving our talk on the banana leaf, like the white man's talk. But I don't know what's wrong with these two. And he looked at us and he said, what's wrong with you two? What's wrong with your heads? This is not a difficult language. This is an easy language. It's simple. In fact, the whole village speaks this language. And so he decided he was going to adopt us, and he was going to come every day to help us learn this language. And I remember when I learned enough of the language that I tried to witness to him. And he was the very first one I tried to witness to. We all start with John 3:16. And I tried translating those verses, but I found out in trying to witness to people that, the heart is not the center of emotion. It's the throat. That's what's meaningful. You don't go tell your husband or your wife, I love you with my whole heart. You would say, honey, I love you with my whole throat. And so you ask Jesus into your throat, not to your heart. And so I was talking to this old man about asking Jesus into his life. And he pointed to his throat. He said, you mean my throat? Yes. I said, why don't you ask Jesus? And God's Holy Spirit will come into your life. Well, we had this little prayer, and I really do believe he was the very first believer to ask Jesus into his life. God chose that man to work with us, and the very first of all the medicine men to come to know Jesus. And that was the beginning of the church.